here's something strange. With a ceasefire clock still ticking, U.S. Marines were filmed rappelling from helicopters onto an Iranian-flagged cargo ship in the North Arabian Sea, after the Navy said it had disabled the vessel's engines in a 6-hour standoff. At almost the same moment, Pakistan was locking down Islamabad with roughly 20,000 security personnel for talks that may or may not happen before the truce expires. Hold those two images together for a second: a diplomatic venue being secured and an interdiction operation being carried out in contested waters. If the story were simply Washington wants calm, that pairing would make no sense. But it does make sense if the talks are not replacing coercion, only accompanying it. That is the thread here. The detail that does not add up is not the rhetoric. Everybody has rhetoric in a crisis. It is the sequencing. President Trump said he might not extend the ceasefire, and in the same breath insisted the blockade would remain. Notice that. Not the blockade will ease if talks progress, not confidence-building measures are under review. The blockade stays. The ship seizures continue. The military options remain unwithdrawn. That is not the language of a power settling into de-escalation. That is the language of a government preserving leverage while keeping the next rung of escalation fully assembled, visible, and ready for immediate use. The backstory matters because this did not begin with one ship, and it did not begin this week. In February 2025, the White House issued National Security Presidential Memorandum 2, formally restoring a maximum pressure policy aimed at denying Iran every path to a nuclear weapon and countering what it called Iran's malign influence. Then, in September 2025, UN sanctions snapped back into force, imposing an arms embargo, a ban on uranium enrichment, and reprocessing and authority for countries to seize prohibited items. So by the time this year's war intensified, Washington was not improvising from scratch. It was operating from a policy architecture already built to combine sanctions, interdictions, and military pressure under one strategic umbrella. Then came the military buildup. Reuters reported in March that the United States was sending thousands of additional Marines and sailors to the Middle East on top of more than 50,000 U.S. troops already in the region. Days later, Reuters reported that thousands more soldiers from the 82nd Airborne were expected as well. And the key phrase in that reporting was not that ground troops had been approved for Iran. It was subtler than that and more revealing. No decision had been made to send them into Iran, but the buildup would expand capacity for potential future operations. Potential future operations. That is Pentagon language for contingency planning. It means the menu is being laid out before anyone orders from it. And what was on that menu? Reuters reporting laid it out in pieces. Options under. Discussion included securing the Strait of Hormuz, potentially with forces on Iran's shoreline, and even operations involving Karg Island, the hub for roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the objectives had not changed. Destroy missile launchers, degrade Iran's defense industrial base and navy, and ensure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. That is not a narrow hostage rescue mission. That is not a one-off punitive strike. That is a broad campaign definition, one that naturally leaves room for more maritime seizures, more strikes on infrastructure tied to military capability, and possibly broader enforcement around energy choke points. Now, consider the nuclear file, because this is where the public paper trail gets especially revealing. On April 8th, the White House said Iran had indicated it would turn over its enriched uranium stockpile, which Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt described as one of Trump's red lines. Hegseth, speaking separately, said the material was buried, being watched, and could still be struck again if necessary. That matters because once a government frames one specific item as a non-negotiable red line and pairs that with an explicit threat of renewed military action, you are no longer looking at diplomacy in the ordinary sense. You are looking at coercive diplomacy backed by live operational planning. The conversation is not whether pressure will be used. The conversation is how much more pressure Washington thinks it can apply before Tehran folds. But the more the negotiations come into focus, the less settled they appear. Reuters reported on April 16th that both sides had scaled back from a comprehensive peace agreement and were instead pursuing a temporary memorandum to prevent a return to conflict. The same report said the deepest disputes remained over the fate of Iran's highly enriched uranium and the length of any halt to nuclear work. Iranian sources described a huge gap. Washington wanted a much longer suspension of enrichment than Tehran would accept, while Iran wanted sanctions relief and access to frozen funds. In other words, the talks are not resolving the hardest questions. They are circling them, buying time around them, and maybe postponing them. That is not a settlement. That is a pause with teeth. Then came the part that clicked for a lot of diplomats watching this closely. Reuters reported on April 19th that European officials feared the United States was chasing a fast, superficial framework deal that could create months or even years of technical deadlock afterward. Read that again slowly. Allies were not warning that Washington was too dovish. They were warning that Washington might lock in a politically useful headline while leaving the hard mechanics of enforcement, verification, and sanctions relief unresolved. And that is crucial, because a fragile agreement with unresolved mechanics is not a stable off-ramp. It is a holding pattern in which each side keeps preparing for failure, because failure remains the most plausible outcome. Meanwhile, the International Atomic Energy Agency has been saying something even more basic and more alarming. In its February 2026 Safeguards report, the agency said it could not verify the current size, composition, or whereabouts of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, could not verify whether enrichment had been suspended, and could not verify Iran's inventories of centrifuges and related equipment. It also said that without broader access under the additional protocol, it cannot provide credible assurance about the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran. That means the central object of the current confrontation is, by the IAEA's own account, only partially visible. So when Washington talks about watching the stockpile and Tehran talks about sovereign rights, both sides are arguing over material that the world's top nuclear watchdog says it cannot fully account for right now. And that brings us back to the ship. The Tauska seizure was not just another angry statement. It was enforcement. Reuters reported that the vessel was likely carrying what Washington deemed dual-use items, that China expressed concern over the interception, and that oil prices rose around 5% as traffic through Hormuz dropped to near standstill, with only 3 crossings in 12 hours. Consider what that means in practice. A blockade that remains in force. Maritime interception normalized. Cargoes judged by Washington standard, not an agreed international mechanism. Energy markets reacting in real time. This is what escalation looks like when it is modular. It does not always begin with a dramatic new war vote or a sudden invasion. Sometimes it begins with the machinery of restriction becoming routine. So here is the revelation, and it lands quietly because the evidence is doing the work. The United States does appear to be preparing for further escalation with Iran, not in the narrow sense that a final decision for a larger war has been publicly made, because there is no verified public evidence of that. But in the more important sense, yes, Washington is clearly preserving and expanding the capability to escalate on short notice. The troop buildups, the blockade, the uranium red line, the warnings about striking infrastructure, the fallback to an interim memorandum, the interdiction of shipping, the readiness to use secondary sanctions, these are not isolated acts. They form a ladder. And the point of building a ladder is not to admire it. The point is to be able to climb. And here is the part that should concern all of us. The Strait of Hormuz typically handles about 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied gas supply. Reuters also found in March that 65% of Americans believed Trump would order troops into a large-scale ground war in Iran, while only 7% supported that idea. So the stakes are not abstract. They are gasoline prices, Gulf infrastructure, global shipping insurance, allied cohesion, and the risk that a policy built around maximum pressure becomes trapped by its own logic. Because once you have declared red lines, moved forces, started interceptions, and told the world the blockade stays no matter what, backing down stops looking like diplomacy and starts looking politically like retreat. That is how countries slide from leverage into momentum, and from momentum into commitments they did not originally intend to keep. There are still open questions. Is the Tauska seizure the exception or the template? Is the blockade a bargaining chip meant to force uranium concessions, or the beginning of a longer effort to squeeze Iran's economy until the regime accepts terms it has rejected for years? And perhaps most importantly, if the IAEA still cannot fully verify what remains of Iran's nuclear stockpile and infrastructure, what exactly would count for either side as proof that de-escalation is safe? Until those questions are answered, every military movement, every sanctions notice, and every temporary diplomatic formula should be read not as a resolution, but as part of an unstable transition between one phase of conflict and the next.